March 30th, 1916, newspapers across America were citing the gallantry of Colonel Dodd and his cavalry troop at the Battle of Guerrero. Now, even though Pancho Villa was not at the battle, it was only a matter of time before he was captured. We had him on the run. Yeah, right. Modern-day newspaper reporters have nothing on the reporters back in the day. Those reporters could take one event and blow it all out of proportion to its actual importance. Facts were just an annoying thing they had to suppress or push to the side in order to tell a good story. They believed in the old adage, don't let the facts get away in a good story. Some of the sample headlines: American cavalry in a battle with Villa bandits, surprised by Colonel Dodd, retreat 10 miles, they lose, 30 killed. Here's another headline: Mexican outlaws routed by Dodd's cavalry, Villa reportedly badly wounded. Smashing blow dealt Villa bandit, wounded in flight, his early capture predicted. The best headline of the battle was in the Washington Times, April 1st, 1916. Boost for Wilson seen in Dodd's ride. Early capture of Villa would end much criticism of administration policy. Now, it looks like that Washington paper was not an avid supporter of Wilson. So anyways, when we last left our intrepid hero, that is, if you're Mexican, murdering bandit, if you're an American, was the day before the Battle of Guerrero. Villa was hurriedly escorted by 150 men south. He was suffering from gunshot wounds in the hip and a broken leg, which he received in an encounter with the forces of Carranza's troops a few days earlier. Meanwhile, back at Pershing's headquarters, the general was planning his strategy. After sending out the 7th and 10th Cavalry from Colonia Dublin on March 17th and 18th, Pershing realized that if they didn't capture Villa during this initial stage of the pursuit, his forces would scatter. Pershing was going to need more men. In their monograph, The Mexican Punitive Expedition under Brigadier General John J. Pershing, United States Army, 1916-17, Robert Thomas and Inez Allen wrote, General Pershing organized 4 new detachments and established field headquarters at Namaquipa. From that point, he would be in a better position to keep in touch with his troops as they advanced southward. Now, Pershing was anticipating the need for such a widening of the search area. Also, in Colonel Dodd's first report after the battle, he confirmed his theory when he wrote in paragraph 12, with Villa probably permanently disabled, Lopez seriously wounded, and Hernandez dead, the blow administered this morning to the Vista party would seem to be pretty well disintegrating it. The pursuit of the elusive Pancho Villa was turning into a guerrilla war. The Carranza government was less than helpful, even though the Carranza government sent a draft of the formal agreement with the United States to accept U.S. troops in Mexico on the 27th through their ambassador in Washington, D.C. The basic agreement outline stated the reciprocal crossing of troops over the boundary lines when in hot pursuit of bandits was acceptable. Now, this agreement wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Now, after the Battle of Guerrero, the attitudes changed. 2 days later, Special U.S. Representative Rogers cabled the State Department on March 31st, 1916, stating, had an interview with Cabrera today, was informed General Carranza and General Obregon think it will be necessary to request withdrawal of our troops in a short time in the event of failure to capture Villa soon. This considered doubtful, as reports here are that Villa, unimpeded, rapidly making for the mountains. They fear political effect if no such action taken. Sentiment here seems to support such a policy. In his report of the expedition, Pershing stated the American forces tried repeatedly to coordinate their efforts to capture Villa with those of the Carranza government, but with little or no success. See, Carranza was between a rock and a hard place. Villa was a thorn in his side. He needed to get rid of him. However, the people of the Chihuahua district, where U.S. forces were operating, supported Villa. Carranza's generals were none too happy and started putting pressure on him to kick the Americans out. He had no choice but to renege on the agreement. So Pershing not only had to contend with duplicitous locals and bad intelligence, he now had to deal with hostile local officials and Carranza forces doing everything they could to impede the expedition's process. You know, you'd think we would have learned our lesson from this first foray of fighting a guerrilla war. But now, we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. I'm just saying, The similarities are interesting. Okay, so the pursuit is on. In his report, Pershing stated, after the fight at Guerrero, the detachment of Villa's command scattered to the four winds, some being reported as returning north to the mountains of the Bachaniva, others to Providencia, while others were hurrying south. Rumors, reported, and even positive assertions by natives would have indicated Villa's departure in almost any direction and his presence in several places at once. So Pershing sends his additional columns out to block all the passes to the north and west of Bachanvilla. On March 30th, Pershing orders Dodd's column to scout the countryside around Guerrero thoroughly and make every effort to locate Villa or any of his followers left in that section. Pershing received reports that Villa was then heading to the west of Bachaniva. He ordered Major Howe's column, consisting of 10 officers and 255 enlisted men, to scout the mountains from the west and return to Bachaniva from the south. Now, Major Tompkins' column, composed of 11 officers and 160 enlisted men, moved by a night march to Santa Ana to cover the western slopes. Both columns uniting on the 1st at Bachaniva. Pershing, in the meantime, moved his headquarters to Bachaniva. On April 1st, both officers reported to him in person that there was no trace of the bandits. They couldn't find him anywhere. Now, with no trace of Villa in the north and west, and all the passes into the mountains to the north and west of Bachaniva blocked, Pershing ordered his 3 columns to move south. Now, Colonel Brown was directed to take the route furthest east, Major Tompkins and Howe to cover the center and west areas respectively, and all 3 columns converged at a point to be designated near the Chihuahua-Durango border. Colonel Dodd's column had the unenviable job of guarding the trails leading into the mountains on the west side of the operations area. On April 1st, Colonel Brown led his force through the mountains. Now, after crossing the divide, Brown's force was now on the open range. His local guide did not tell him about the small village of Agua Caliente. Now, the first Brown realized his column had come under attack was when his advance guard ran into a band of Villistas outside of that village. It was 3:15 p.m. Now, James P. Finley, in 1993, writing for the Buffalo Soldiers at Hachua, that was a magazine of the Fort Hachua Museum, describes the battle. Brown's forces encountered some 150 Villistas under Villista General Beltran at a ranch where they had taken refuge. Captain Selwyn D. Smith E Troop was on the point, and at the first exchange of fire, the Villistas galloped away to the south. A running fight ensued with Captain Orlando C. Troxell's Troop H and Captain William S. Valentine's Troop F, both under the command of Major Charles Young, trying to cut them off from the east. Now, Captain George B. Rodney's Troop G and Captain Albert E. Phillips' machine gun troop went racing through the village. The highlight of the fight occurred when some of the Mexicans took up a strong position behind a stone wall to pour fire on the Americans. Brown ordered Major Young to charge the position with Troops H and F. And the soldiers, buoyed by the prospect of being part of the first real cavalry charge since the Spanish-American War, leapt to their saddles, drew their .45s, and swept down on the Villistas. As they increased their speed to the gallop, withholding their fire, they began to yell, and the Mexicans ran off into the woods to their rear. Captain Troxell described the outcome of the clash. "We never saw these Villistas as opponents again. None of our men were hit, and the horses were the only part of our command that had not enjoyed the skirmish. One horse was wounded, one of mine dropped exhausted, one died that night. We killed one the next morning, and one could just get along by being led. I don't know about the losses of the animals in the other troops. We captured several ponies and mules apart from their pack train. We know of 3 Mexicans killed, and reports from Mexican sources, as noted in American papers, gave their casualties as 42, but I doubt that the number, and do not believe any of our officers think we got that many, as they were never out in the open and it was a running fight. We had no opportunity to look for the casualties, nor did we particularly care to do so. The troopers clashed with the bandits for about 6 or 7 miles to the east, through the main timber range to El Mestimo. We gave up the chase only at dark. We killed 2. By April 3rd, Brown, on his way to San Antonio, received a message from Carnista General Cavazos stating the U.S. Army's assistance in catching Villa was not desired. The mutual cooperation between the United States and Mexico was rapidly coming to an end. Now, Major Tompkins, in the center column followed the Vista Trail to Santa Maria on the 2nd, then covering some of the same areas Major Brown, passing through Agua Caliente after the fight to Namapachi on the 3rd. Now, upon arriving in San Antonio on the 4th, he received a report that Villa was moving in the direction of San Borja. Tompkins lit out after Villa. Upon approaching the village, he was handed a note from General Cavacos as follows. On the 3rd of April, I telegraphed you that I thought it prudent to suspend the advance of your troops until we both received orders on this subject from the citizens' military commander of the state. As I have just received knowledge that your forces are advancing in accordance with the itinerary which I have prepared for the troops under my own command, I would esteem it very much if you would suspend your advance until you receive the orders to which I refer, by which means there can be avoided a conflict, which may occur by reason of your advance. Your attentive and true servant, General Jose Cavatos. Boy, how quickly attitudes change. President Carranza realized having 5,000 armed American troops on his soil was not going to win him any popularity contest with his people or his generals. He decided the Americans had to go. Now, Tompkins held a meeting with General Cavato. At that meeting, the general informed Major Tompkins that the American forces would not be allowed to continue south. Cavazo also informed Tompkins that that Villa was dead and buried, so there's no need for you to be here. Well, unable to reach higher headquarters for guidance and a possible solution to an international incident in the making, Tompkins removed his troops 4 miles to Cienguitas, thus avoiding an incident. While he camped at that area, Tompkins received intelligence that Villa had passed through Santa Maria de Cuevas the day before. So he marched to Santa Rosalia on the 6th, remaining there on the 7th so he could shoe his horses and rest his command. By this time, studies of Pancho Villa were placing him all over Chihuahua. Meanwhile, Major House, commanding the center column, received very credible intelligence while camped at Santa Borja that Villa was only slightly wounded, that his Lieutenant Pablo Lopez had been killed. Villa, with an escort of 50 men, was following down the Sierra Paras mountains to Durango. House stated in his report, I struck southward with the utmost vigor possible and named Casa Colorado, struck Villa's trail 6 days old. We followed it through the mountains' vastness over the nearly impossible Deblina Trail. We gained nearly 3 days on Villa's trail. Now, by the 8th of April, Howe's command was 10 miles south of San Borja when he ran into General Cavazos' forces of 300 Mexican troops. Cavazo was doing everything he could to create an incident. Howe's report, at about 10:30 a.m. April 8th, at a point about 10 miles south of San Borja, my command was charged by the mounted forces of General Cavazo. His platoon in advance was reinforced by 50 or 60 men, and all took up the gallop, yelled and drew their rifles as they approached us. In the meantime, our men were promptly being placed in an arroyo, which afforded a splendid field of fire and excellent cover. I personally moved between the two lines, waving my hat and calling in Spanish that we were Americans. About 100 of Cavazo's men reached a point within 50 yards of me before they stopped. If one shot had been fired, I feel convinced that we would have destroyed half of Cavazo's 300 men. The control which our officers exercised over their men and the display of splendid judgment by officers and non-commissioned officers in a delicate situation saved what came near being a serious complication, serious international incident. Our officers were left generally with no conviction that General Cavazo was seeking conflict. His manner and tone were quite offensive. What Major Howes left out in his report was the fact that one shot, if fired, probably would have killed him. Now, talk about understating the dangers he and his troops had faced. Again, when he wrote, our officers were left generally with the conviction that General Cavazo was seeking conflict. His manner and tone quite offensive. You think? Now, Major Howes, interesting man. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for bravery during the Indian Wars. An interesting aspect of his character was demonstrated when he was Commandant of West Point in 1907. He threatened to discharge an entire class from the academy over a hazing incident. This officer was a hard case and nobody to mess with. Well, anyways, Carranza and his generals were doing whatever they could to impede Pershing's mission. This was just the beginning of Major Howe's trouble with Carranza forces, hostile locals and Villistas. On April 9th, Howe and his force made camp at San Jose del Cito. In his typical understating of events, Howe noted that the natives were found to be generally unfriendly and, as expected, fired into the camp during the night. Now, the next day, Howe continued his march to South Santa Cruz de Herrera with the intention of intercepting Villa if he came down from the impassable mountains in an effort to get to safety in Durango. All day long, Howe's column was fired upon. It was Villistas or forces of Carranza? No one knows. At 5:30 p.m., his column was viciously attacked near La Joya de Herrera. Howe's force was able to break up the attack and routed the attackers, sending them in every direction. By April 11th, Howe's column had reached Santa Cruz del Herrera. Surrounding the town, the plan was to attack it and capture a reported group of Villistas occupying the town. The attack only managed to capture a few guns, but cost the life of Lieutenant Beltran, that's the son of Villista General Beltran, and one soldier. Colonel Brown's eastern column was working its way south to Cienguta. It was while en route to that place that Brown received a message dropped by the 1st Aero Squadron to head for Parral. They had no radios in those days. Now, passing through the town of Santa Rosalia, he met up with Major Tompkins' column. The two officers exchanged information. Major Tompkins decided to work his way southeast to Parral. During the march to Parral, Tompkins' force repeatedly came under fire from General Graza. Obviously a case of bad intelligence on the part of Graza. I mean, the Mexican Federals were working with us to stop Villa. Yeah, okay. Anyways, Tompkins made camp at Concho, that's the Valley de Zaragos, at around 11 p.m. It was at this point that Carranza captain, who had come from Parral, came into camp and gave Tompkins information of Carranza and the Villista troops in the area. Captain said he would send word to General Laxanos, Carranza's commander at Parral, of Tompkins' advance to the south, so that the Carranista commander would have men meet Tompkins' force in a sunny camp and arrange for provisions. Now, upon reaching Parral around 12 noon, the promised Mexican forces assigned to help Tompkins were nowhere to be seen. Realizing the situation could go south in a heartbeat, Thompson took his advance guard to the general's quarters to find out what went wrong. Now, Tompkins' report does not go into detail about how the general responded to his failure to provide logistical support to Tompkins. All he wrote about was just questioning the general. He gave us some information, but not much. In fact, the general denied all knowledge of any such promise or agreement, but the general realized he would have to do something to ease the suspicions of the American major. So, Lozano personally escorted Tompkins' column to the bivouac area. Mounting up, Lozano and several of his officers led Tompkins' column to the camp outside of town. As the pack train was leaving the edge of town, the rear guard was fired into, and a few moments later, armed Carranza soldiers appeared on the hills to the south. Realizing he and his men were heading into a trap, Tompkins notified General Lozano that his men had been shot at. Letting loose a string of profanity, the general wheeled his horse around and charged back to the end of the column, followed by one of his officers. Drawing his saber, General Lozano charged into the unruly mob and began beating them back with his saber. Now, to make sure the crowd understood the general's intention, the officer accompanying him drew his pistol and shot down 4 members of the mob in an attempt to disperse it. This display of authority did nothing to quell the angry mob. Tompkins ordered his rear guard into a defensive position in order to cover the retreat of the main body. Now, General Lozano decided it was time to leave the Americans to themselves. He beat it back to Parral. As Tompkins' column was making its way under sporadic fire to the camp, an officer from General Lozano's command delivered a message from the general. The message said to Tompkins he was not to stop at Parral but to continue his retreat immediately. Now, using the proper military courtesy, Tompkins replied that the general was short and sweet. He would leave the district after he reached his camp and received his supplies that were promised, as well as feeding his horses. Did the messenger give a signal that Tompkins was not cooperating? No one really knows. However, right after the messenger left, it was reported by others that he headed into the hills where the Mexican soldiers were, and it was at this point that a squad of Carranza soldiers on the hill to the south of the column shifted positions and occupied a hill on Tompkins' left flank. This squad was in a perfect firing position to attack the main body of the column. Tompkins stated in his report, "I yelled at them to go back. They paid no attention. I then sent the squad to drive them back. As soon as this squad moved out, the soldiers on the hill to the south opened fire on me and I answered. A few minutes later, Sergeant Wrigley on my left was killed. The firing in my front became heavier. I could see that the soldiers in the town were both against me, so I decided to retire." Tompkins had a force of about 100 men. The garrison at Peral was anywhere between 500 and 600 armed soldiers, as well as an angry town with an estimated population of about 20,000 people, and a large portion of those people were well armed. Anyways, Tompkins had to do a fighting retreat. So at about 1:30 in the afternoon, Tompkins began a 60-mile retreat. His force was constantly under attack from the Carranza soldiers. He described the retreat in his report. "I retreated and found that 2 men had been wounded. When the command was formed, I retreated 16 miles, followed all the way by about 300 Carranista soldiers. I covered my retreat by halting, dismounting, and deploying my rear guard, and the 2 troops in succession. During this retreat, Private Ledford of K Troop was wounded a second time and died in the saddle. I killed or wounded 12 of the enemy," so reported by the Carranistas. Tompkins did the 60-mile retreat in 2.5 hours. Just outside of the village of Santa Cruz de Villegas, he set up defensive positions. The Carranza troops scattered into the hills to the south and southwest, continuing the fire. The firing ceased at about 6:50. He had sent couriers out who had gone back to the north for support. They arrived here at about 7 p.m. And this is the report of Colonel Brown after the messengers came in. Basically, Brown said the 10th Cavalry raced to their horses to reinforce his men. Within minutes, the Buffalo soldiers were in their saddles and moving to Santa Cruz Villegas. Now, where Tompkins was reported to be making his stand. An hour later, with darkness falling, the buglers of the 10th sounded some calls, and a faint answering call to let them know they were at the American camp. It was obvious that the beleaguered Tompkins was glad to see the relief force come up. In the Hachula Illustrated, James Finley recounted the scene described by Captain Rodney. "The sound of hoofbeats brought Tompkins to the gate, and he gave us a warm welcome. He had been wounded in the arm and had injured a leg by falling over some hastily completed entrenchments that he had been supervising. Boy, was he glad to see us. As we splashed through the ford, he shouted to us. I can hear his words yet. Major Charles Young, one of the 6 Negro officers of the Army and our squadron commander, was riding by me at the head of the advance guard when Tompkins sighted him and called out, 'By God, they were glad to see the 10th at Santiago in '98, but I'm a damn sight gladder to see you now. I could kiss every one of you.' Young grinned and called back, 'Hello, Tompkins. You can start in on me right now.' There was no further talk of kissing. By morning, Major Howes and Allen had arrived with detachments from the 11th Cavalry. The Americans now numbered 600 men. During this fighting retreat, Tompkins' forces suffered 2 killed, 6 wounded, Tompkins being one of the wounded, and 1 missing. More than 40 Carranistas were reported killed and an unknown number wounded. On the morning of the 13th, Colonel Brown and Major Young led a detail towards Peral to recover the body of Ledford, killed in the fight the day before. When they located Ledford's body, it was stripped of outer clothing and shoes. They also found a stray dog, which had been standing watch over the lifeless Ledford throughout the night. The men brought Ledford and the dog back. Now, Colonel Brown also requested the return of Sergeant Richley's body, who had been killed at the beginning of the ambush. The Peral ambush marked the end of any semblance of cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico in the effort to capture Pancho Villa. The pursuit phase of the operation was over. It only lasted 16 days, but the operation would continue and the diplomatic maneuvering would begin. But that is a video for another time. Anyways, what have we learned from this foray into international affairs of a foreign power? Well, using a sledgehammer to swat a fly will never get the job done. In this case, sending 5,000 U.S. troops into northern Mexico only exacerbated an already tense diplomatic situation between Mexico and the U.S. Also, if any of you ever find yourself as President of the United States and you are contemplating using a force, make sure you have an exit strategy before committing U.S. troops. I'm just saying. I mean, it could have helped Lyndon Johnson and George W. Bush. Saying mission accomplished does not actually mean the mission was accomplished. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. It would be great if you could leave a comment below. Helps the algorithm. Also, hit that thumbs up button and ring the bell. This way you'll be notified when I post my next video. Thank you for watching.